Today's video, a Q&A with Coach Ken. You've been sending in your questions, we're going to answer them. I can see you, you're on camera. Ooh, bit of product placement. Guys, this is Ken. I know there's a fair few new viewers who won't know him. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure thing, man. Coach Ken. I've been coaching road cycling and time trials full-time for about 5 years now. I race as well, got an elite license, been racing for about 10 years. Do time trials road racing, ride for Noon Sigma Sports. And yeah, me and Franny go way back. Well, I think it is a good time to be thinking about indoor training tips, because all of a sudden everyone's going, oh, I shouldn't be riding outside, or I don't feel like I want to ride outside. And everyone's riding indoors twice as much as they were before, and realizing all of these things, making lots of mistakes that they might not have noticed before if they were doing one turbo a week. But if you're doing 6 days back to back on the turbo, it's going to grind you down pretty quick if you're not going about it the right way.
So I've got a big long list of questions here from my YouTube viewers. If you'd be so kind as to answer them.
Sure,
the best you can.
Loads of questions. It was really good.
There's so many, right? So thank you guys for sending them in. First question of today is from Michael Stanley, and he says, weekly training load. Is there a way you can ride indoor trainer every day and still recover, rest properly? What sort of rhythm is best? 1 hard session, 2 recovery days, repeat, weekly blocks. Before COVID, having days off the bike was easy. You could go to the gym or play football. Now there's no other way to exercise, and I find mentally some of it's quite hard to keep sane. I'm zwifting myself into a pit.
Great question. You could probably split it out into a few different areas, really. First bit is, can you ride the trainer indoors every day and still recover and rest properly? And if you come back to basic training principles, really it doesn't matter whether you're indoors or outdoors, you're still trying to balance stress and recovery. So you apply stress to the body, you recover, and that's how you adapt. So whether you're applying that stress indoors or outdoors, you still need those periods of hard and easy in order to keep moving forwards. I think that it's an easy trap to fall into if you're just on Zwift every day, to get caught up in the group rides and the races, and all of a sudden every day becomes a hard day. So the trick really is to understand what constitutes an easy ride and find a way of enjoying doing that indoors. It's easy to do a couple of hours endurance pace or base pace outdoors because you're watching the world go by, and it's actually quite nice, but doing that indoors can be a little bit more challenging if you haven't got the right entertainment set up, or you're finding it boring for whatever reason. So finding out what keeps you motivated indoors to do an easy ride is going to be the secret there to balancing that recovery and rest, like he's asked. Next part of the question is saying that, oh, having a day off the bike was easy before because he could go outside and go to the gym or play football, doing something like that. Personally, I would say those aren't actually easy days or recovery days. So it might have been the case before that he was thinking that a day off the bike is recovery. But if you replace your recovery with a heavy weight session or 2 hours playing football, you're still adding stress, and it's not going to be very easy to recover whilst you're doing all of those things. So don't be shy of taking a day off. That might be exactly what you need. Just put your feet up and make the most of the fact that you're not having to get out and go to work and be up and about all day. You could get a proper day's recovery, get some more sleep, do all of those things rather than replacing your easy days with gym or football. And you might recover much better and be able to train harder when you're doing your hard sessions. So the question was 1 hard session, 2 recovery days, do it in weekly blocks. Like, what's the sort of advice on that? And really it's personal preference, and everybody recovers at different rates, and everyone's at a different stage of their journey in terms of how long they've been training for and how hard they train, all of those kind of things. Personally, I think everyone can get their head around working in weekly blocks. I think that does make sense. Whether you're a full-time athlete, whether you've got a job, the world kind of revolves around the weekdays and the weekends. So it does make sense to stick to that. And if, again, you come back to basic training principles, all of the studies and the research kind of look at how many high intensity days per week should you be having, what's the best formula for getting the most improvements off the least amount of work. Generally speaking, you'd say 2 high intensity days and the rest low intensity off or moderate. So I like to split the week up as a hard day, easy day, then a moderate day, then an easy day, and then kind of repeat it. So then go a hard day, easy day. Or that 6th day, you'd make it your long ride, and by that time you're really tired, so you're more likely to make your long ride low intensity and get the benefits of being out for a long time rather than pushing as hard as possible. And that's 6 days, so then the 7th day you'd have off completely. And that's quite a nice way of getting a good mix of everything into the week. So you got 2 hard days, 2 easy days, a moderate session and a long session, and that's pretty good for most people doing all sorts of different events at different lengths. You can go a long way on that kind of rhythm. And then I'd say, looking a step back from that, you wouldn't just follow that every week forever. You need some kind of easy week at some point in there where you remove most or all of the high intensity and just ride easy for a week. So you give your body a chance to actually recover fully and adapt and come back stronger in the next one. So that might be every 3rd week, might be every 4th week. It all depends on your life, your work situation, what else you've got going on.
Next question is from Chris O'Hanlon. I've been training with Trainer Road for 2 years. I don't know what that is. Moving from about 4 hours a week to about 9-10 of structured indoor riding. But my FTP doesn't seem to increase past 255. 4 watts per kilo. Nutrition and sleep seem to be good. Any pointers to keep pushing it up?
So Trainer Road's an indoor training app. So it's kind of like Zwift, but just the training plans and none of the like video game bit.
Sounds terrible.
Do you want to do that?
Well, it's pretty good. Like if all you want is a training plan, it's a nice option. I think the value you get from something like Zwift is on the entertainment side of things. So it keeps you interested, keeps you getting on the bike. The value you get from a coach is the personalization, the one-on-one feedback, and having someone that you're accountable to. If I've read that question right, and he's been doing 9 to 10 hours of structured indoor riding a week for the last 2 years, it sounds like he's already been locked down. And he's going to cope with this next few weeks just fine. If the question is, I'm not seeing my threshold increase, how do I make it increase? The first thing you need to do is make sure that you're measuring it correctly, you know what you're looking for, and that you're certain that it isn't getting better. Because one thing that I see quite a lot in people's training is that they might think that their threshold is staying the same over a number of weeks or months or whatever it is, but actually if you look at the sessions that they're doing and the amount of work they're doing at threshold, their time to exhaustion is significantly increasing, which is something you might typically see before that threshold increases in number. So if Chris is threshold is at 255, and at the minute he could do 4 5-minute efforts at that and feel okay, and his heart rate isn't going through the roof, in a few months' time, if he keeps working with that zone, he might be able to do 4 10-minute efforts, or even 3 20-minute efforts at 255 watts with a nice stable heart rate without it feeling like it's a maximum effort. It might still be the case that his threshold is a similar number, but the amount of work he can do at threshold has significantly increased. So it's not necessarily just, is my threshold going up or down? That means I'm getting better or worse. There's lots of other factors to consider as well. Especially when you refer to it as FTP, because that's your 60-minute power. People don't often do 60-minute tests to get a true impression of what their long duration sustainable power is. If you're using a short test to figure it out, your short duration power is improving, but everything that is the long duration isn't. So there's lots of things going on, and you need to make sure your test is the same every time, it's repeatable, and you're using the same equipment. So you might have had 3 different power meters over the last 2 years, and his threshold's gone up 20 watts, but now he's just on a better power meter than he was before. So there's lots of things in there that you have to be careful of when you're getting really hyper focused on that threshold number. I think take a step back and ask yourself what your goals actually are, and tie them into real world performance. Is that real world performance improving? Because if someone came to me and said my threshold isn't going up, hasn't gone up for 3 years, but I have won 5 races this year, I'd say, well, actually your performance is improving, because the thing that you're actually training for, you're now successful at. It doesn't really matter whether your threshold's up or down if you're actually hitting your goals and the real world performance is better. So I think make sure you're focusing on the right thing is something I'd say. And that probably ties into the whole reason for us having this conversation right now. Just basically overnight, everybody's race season has disappeared for the next 2 to 3 months at least.
Yeah.
And performance in races was a big part of people's motivation. So I would say to someone, what are your goals? And it would all be around like, oh, do you get this in this race, this in this time trial? So that has to shift now. You need to really sit down and understand why you're training and what motivates you. And perhaps it would be good to set some different goals for the short term in order to keep you consistent, keep you on the bike, and keep you training to a point that you're at least going to maintain your fitness. Because it's going to be really difficult to push through those fitness tests, through a 20-minute test, or through really, really hard training sessions, if you haven't got an event in the next couple of months that you're thinking about all the time and that's really motivating you to get out there. So if you can replace those goals that have all of a sudden vanished with something else, be it an indoor event or whatever, I don't know, a weight loss goal, some kind of other goal, then that's a shift in mindset that it would be a good time to have a think about right now. Maybe off topic for the question just there, but I think it's all important to think about right now.
So next question is from Morris Jamie, and he says, should I go running to change muscle groups as the turbo trainer is constantly using the same muscles?
I really like this question. It's obviously come from the perspective of I can't bear the thought of being on the turbo 7 days a week and not being able to do anything else. So it's really positive that he's looking for different alternatives to keep moving and keep fit. Running is one that cyclists often jump to just when they're looking to do something else. And that's fine, but I would say run sparingly. I would always carry a word of caution when pure cyclists go out for a run, because you're not used to the impact, and because you're really aerobically fit, you might not necessarily be challenging your heart and lungs all that much. But if you go out for an hour run, aerobically you're fine, but you might have absolutely wrecked your muscles, your tendons, your ligaments, and not be able to walk for 3 days. So just be careful if you do go running. Do it slowly and steadily and build up from really, really short durations that might feel like 20-minute run, that's easy. But okay, I'm sure it is, but week 1, just be careful with it. Do 1 or 2 runs a week. Don't go straight to 6 runs a week. So easy for cyclists to pick up injuries in the matter of 2-3 weeks without really seeing it coming. So I would just say be careful with that one. And why is he looking to change muscle groups? If your goals are around racing bikes, then the turbo trainer is about as specific as you can get right now. Any other sport is going to be unavoidably less specific than riding on the turbo trainer. And running and cycling, it's not necessarily that big a change in muscle groups. It's still your legs. You're using them differently, but I'd say the turbo training is fine if all your goals are to perform well.
I made exactly that mistake and I did 10k.
And how did you feel for the next few days after that?
Oh, I hurt my foot.
It's so easy to do.
So easy, because you can run.
You're used to going out and exercising for 3 hours.
Yeah. Next question's from a guy called Dan Lichtenberger.
Nice.
Question for Ken. How can we use this forced stay at home to break through a fitness plateau? I've been training consistently for a few years but seem to be stuck. It's similar to another question, isn't it? Similar to one of the past questions.
Yeah, I'm stuck. What do I do? So it's going to come down to the same point, really. How are you measuring your progress? Why do you think it is a fitness plateau? If you've been measuring it outside the whole time, maybe this is a good opportunity to test your fitness indoors in a really controlled environment and then repeat that in 4 weeks' time. So then you are doing really consistent, repeatable tests. I've coached people in the past who, coming from this same perspective, have gone, right, there's this ride that I like to do once a year and I use it to track whether I've got better than last year or not. And it's not a controlled environment at all. So this guy that I'm talking about would go out and he'd do his ride and he'd go, I did it in 55 minutes this time. Last year it was 56. I've got better. And my question to him was, well, did you produce more power? Were you using the same equipment? Were the weather conditions the same? Were you on the same tires? And if you can't answer all of those questions, you can't be certain of whether your fitness is the thing that's made you go faster. So the advantage you get from indoor training is that you can be more precise on what it is that is improving or getting worse, because you take all of those environmental elements out of the equation.
Matt Clegg asks, if training for E12 crits and endurance track races, are there any aerobic fatigue resistance benefits in regularly doing long endurance road rides 4 hours plus? Or is it likely to cause a lot of fatigue which would diminish your ability to do high intensity intervals? What else would you recommend training wise for these kinds of races?
Cool. Yeah, this is a really good question. It's obviously coming from someone that is of a higher level, who's racing E12 crits and is doing races on the track. And I think really the question boils down to, if I just go out and do longer rides, is that going to help me? And you would come back to, right, what is the event that you're training for? And what are the critical factors that are going to determine success in those events? And it's an easy trap to fall into, to think, it's a crit, it's a track race, it's all about my sprint and my top end power. But all of these races typically are like an hour long. A track race might be 20 minutes long, but even then you're way beyond the duration of race, where you're on the borderline of, is this for a sprinter or is this for an endurance guy? I think most people would say, if you look at individual pursuit on the track, which is about a 4-minute effort, they're quite clear in that, that is for an endurance guy, but it's a 4-minute long race. So if you stretch that out to a 20-minute, a 60-minute race, of course it's an endurance focused race. So you could lump all those endurance events together and go like, right, what are the critical factors for success in this? And it's going to be aerobic capacity. It's going to be fatigue resistance, like he says. So doing a long 4-hour road ride is going to help in terms of improving those things like aerobic capacity and fatigue resistance. You got two main pathways to signal the adaptations that are favorable for those events, and they're long duration or high intensity. So you need a combination of those two things throughout your week of training. And if you're at a very high level, it may well take 2, 3, 4 hours in order to continue seeing those endurance improvements. If you're doing 8 to 12 hours a week, probably a 2-hour easy ride isn't going to do much for you. It's not to say that there's no space for that in your program, if you want to keep the volume up and get a nice recovery ride in. But if you're looking to use a long ride in order to improve your endurance performance, you may well need to go for 4 hours. A good metric that you can look at is how much your heart rate is drifting throughout that ride. So if you're using Training Peaks, there's a metric in there called power heart rate, separated by a little colon. And if that drift is more than 5%, then you can fairly safely say that you are getting some fatigue within that session. If you're staying hydrated and fueled, you can say, if that was a low intensity ride and you're getting that drift, then you're seeing that you've gone hard enough in order to tire yourself out, which is kind of the goal of these things. You may well want to stay under that point in intensity where you start to see drift, just to rack up lots and lots of hours. But I like the approach of going right up to that point of where your aerobic threshold is, that you're starting to really tire out those slow twitch muscle fibers and start to incorporate other groups of muscles in there as well. But I would say to this guy, to Matt, you can only train as hard as you can recover. So he's quite rightly pointed out in his question, if he's doing 4-hour rides and he's too tired for the next 3 days in order to do any more quality training or his high intensity sessions, then it may well be counterproductive. So what you'd have to be conscious of there is that your 4-hour ride is staying low intensity. You're not sprinting out of every corner. You're not smashing up every hill and riding over threshold for 15-20 minutes worth of that ride. You've got to be really disciplined with those endurance rides as you come up through the ranks and become a more competitive cyclist.
Studio Smalltown asks, would you recommend a lactate threshold test? Worth the investment versus possible improvement? I'm taking part in a 300k race, it's pretty flat here, in Sweden, and I'm hoping to finish under 7 hours and 30 minutes. It's approximately 43 k's an hour average speed in a group of 30. It's like a group TT, rotating on the front every 30 seconds. Apart from long endurance sessions, what Zwift 1 hour session would you recommend to be the most bang for your buck? There's a few questions in there.
No, that's cool. I think the first one was on, would I recommend a lactate test? Absolutely. If that's something that you can get access to, it really helps you understand what's going on inside the body at different training intensities. So not just looking at the external load, what you're producing in terms of power output, but what's going on internally as well. Aside from just your heart rate, you can really start to see where those different intensities really get a response, and you start incorporating different energy systems. So it is a really great window into exactly what type of athlete you are, and therefore how you should train. If you were to just look at your power duration curve, you might have two riders of the same weight with the same 60-minute power, and you group them together because they've got the same threshold. However, one might have a really good sprint, whereas the other might have a really good VO2 max. So what the threshold test doesn't tell you is how they came about producing that threshold power. And that is a really critical factor in how you would train those two different athletes. So yes, it gives you a lot more insight in how best to train. Even if you're doing a really long race, like 7.5 hours, that's super long, that's ultra distance. What the lactate test gives you is an insight into your fuel utilization. So how many grams of carbs per hour you're burning through at different intensities. So you could look at the power you might want to hold for the duration of that race and then see how much fuel you're burning through at that intensity. You can then work out how much you should be putting in, or whether it's going to be possible to continue going for that long, if you're going to run out of fuel or not. So I've trained people for 12-hour time trials, and this lactate testing in order to set the fueling strategy and the pacing was a really big part of that. So we know how much roughly you can digest in terms of grams per hour of carbohydrates. At a maximum, that the science would suggest that it's about 80 to 100 grams of carbohydrates per hour, and you'd be really surprised at the power outputs that you would be burning more than that. So when I've done VO2 max tests and when I've done lactate tests before, at my kind of zone 2 pace, so about 235 watts, I'm burning through 99 grams of carbs per hour. So that is pretty much at the maximum that you can digest. So if I was to do a long ride, so like that 7.5 hours, 300k, and I'm trying to ride above 235 watts, which is my zone 2, I know that I'm running up a deficit in terms of the fuel that I can get in and the fuel that's going out. So I've got to be really careful with how much time I spend riding above that point, and also be conscious of what happens when you do ride really hard for a certain amount of time. So if you were to ride a portion of that event on a short climb to stay with the group, and you're doing that above your anaerobic threshold, and you produce an excess of blood lactate, your body's going to want to burn through that first before it starts to come back down into incorporating fat into that mixture of fuel that you're burning. So even just a few minutes at threshold can have a knock-on effect for how many carbs you're burning for the next sort of 10, 15, 20 minutes. So you do have to be really careful with your pacing on those events. And that's not to say you can't go hard for certain sections, but just be aware of how easily you're burning through carbs and how easily you can run out. If you're just doing an hour at that pace, it feels like you're not burning anything at all. But you start going out to those ultra distant events where you're doing 7-8 hours, you're really going to know about it once you get over halfway, if you've been racking up a big deficit.
It's how much food you can carry as well.
Yeah, well, you found that in Australia, didn't you? You going from like one shop to the next and just carrying as much as you could.
Okay, so last question of the day is from Adam Oldham, and he says, training for ultra endurance events using the turbo, question mark, question mark, question mark. That's not really a question, but we can still answer it.
I really like prescribing turbo training sessions for these ultra athletes because it gets them into the mindset of producing power over time and increasing how much work you can do rather than just how many hours can you ride for. And I train Chris Hall, obviously, who you know really well. He does lots of ultra events. He does 2 or 3 sessions a week on the turbo. So for his lifestyle, lives in London, he's got a busy job. Through the week, he can't get out and do those really long rides. So he really needs to maximize the time that he has available for training in order to really focus in on those that endurance capacity that he has. So if he was to try and do an hour and a half ride in the evening outdoors, he'd be going through like 20 minutes of traffic lights to get to a good place to train, and then he'd be interrupted with people and hills and junctions and all of that stuff. So he wouldn't be able to do 2 30-minute efforts at his aerobic threshold. So if he goes in on the turbo, does an hour and a half, he can do those with really good quality, in the right position on the bike, uninterrupted, and get a much better training benefit, a much better use of his time than if he was trying to squeeze it in outside. So even if you are doing ultra long events, it's a great way to train because you get a lot more out of that time. Often say to people that I'm training and they're going outdoors to do their endurance rides, see if you can get less than 20% of that ride time in zone 1 or not pedaling. And it's actually quite tricky to do. You have to be really focused and really on it in order to get the like 80% or more of your ride actually on the pedals and working in those endurance zones. Takes a lot of focus, a lot of discipline. So moving to the turbo takes all of that out of it. And I think people will find that if they're all of a sudden doing all their rides on the turbo, they might actually be doing a lot more work throughout the week. If they're doing an hour every day outside and then all of a sudden doing an hour every day inside, they might be doing 20% more pedaling.
Well, it feels like more.
Yeah, it could be. It wouldn't be unusual for me to see 30-40% of somebody's outdoor ride in zone 1, especially if they're riding in a group. If you go out and you do group rides all the time, you'll be in the wheels for a big portion of that ride. So you're in zone 1, you're not pedaling. There's 20-30% of your power knocked off because you're in the draft. There's none of that on the turbo. So your training load might go through the roof without you even realizing. So you might be getting really tired from all these turbo sessions going, oh my God, I'm only doing 6 hours a week, but I'm knackered. And it could well be because your training load is actually increased because you're doing it indoors.
6 hours of quality.
Yeah. You could be doing an hour more pedaling. Quite easily. It could also be just because of all the extra stress of everything that's going on. I find myself saying quite a lot to people that the training plan assumes that you're recovering well, you're sleeping well, you're eating well. And if any of that changes, then you have to tell me and we have to account for it in the plan. So if all of a sudden you've got loads of extra stress and anxiety because of all of what's going on and you're trying to do the same training, then it's going to be harder to recover from it. So you might find yourself going downhill a little bit. But just know that it's okay to back off a little bit and even do a bit less training than normal, especially now when we don't know when the next event is going to be. So you're much better off going into maintenance mode, enjoying the time that you spend on the bike rather than digging a massive hole for yourself for the next 8 weeks, coming out of that and just being knackered rather than motivated even more and ready to get prepped for your events. Doggo.
He's a postman.
What has he brought? Anything good?
I think he's got coffee.
So Daisy's just on the turbo behind me. I'm going to sign today's video off. I hope you enjoyed the Q&A with Ken. If you would like to hire Ken as a coach, because he's available, I'm going to put his email address and a link to his website down below if you want to check him out. He does proper one-to-one coaching for a range of different athletes. So drop him a message. We're really keen to film more of these style of videos, so if you enjoyed it, let me know, and let me know if you have any more questions for Ken, because we can do this again. We've got time. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you guys soon. Come on, put some effort in.